She slowly lifted her shirt, revealing the fresh wound from yesterday's brutal mission. But as the fabric rose higher, Captain Thorne's breath hitched a sharp, involuntary gasp. His eyes widened, fixed in stunned disbelief on something far more disturbing beneath, a grotesque tapestry of old scars etched across her ribs, screaming a story no official file dared to whisper. Each mark, a brutal, silent testament to unimaginable torment. This wasn't just a soldier, this was a living blueprint of hell itself. A chilling secret that utterly shattered his perception, and the desperate mission she was now about to lead, considered absolutely impossible. You're about to witness how the most broken can become the most formidable. Hit subscribe to Veteran Biker now and prepare for an extraordinary journey into unimaginable resilience. The sterile hum of the medical bay pressed in on Captain Thorne, a dull counterpoint to the storm brewing inside him. He stood rigid, a file clutched in his hand, its edges worn from countless reviews. The official record of Lieutenant Commander Isabella Clarke. It painted a picture of a brilliant mind. Yes, a tactical genius who consistently defied expectations, but also one increasingly prone to recklessness. His own annotations, scribbled in the margins, spoke of a disturbing pattern, high-risk maneuvers, disregard for established parameters, and a recent operation that, while technically successful, had left 3 wounded, including Clarke herself. Whispers had been circulating through the command chain like a virulent fever, suggesting it was time to ground her, perhaps permanently. This morning he was here to confirm those suspicions, to make the difficult but necessary call. He'd called her in, his voice carrying the full weight of his rank and the deep frustration of a commander whose orders had been brazenly defied. "Show me," he'd demanded, his gaze fixed on her, searching for any flicker of remorse, any sign of the promising officer he'd once believed in. Clarke, her posture rigidly controlled despite the fresh injury, had met his gaze without flinching. She was a paradox, a woman who moved with a predatory grace, yet held herself with a stillness that suggested deep, controlled reserves. Her eyes, often described as unnervingly precise in performance reviews, betrayed nothing now but a quiet, almost defiant resignation. Without a moment's hesitation, Clarke had begun to lift her medical tunic. The movement was economical, practiced, almost clinical. Thorne's eyes, accustomed to the raw realities of combat and the aftermath, braced themselves for the sight of the recent wound. He expected an angry laceration, perhaps some bruising, the telltale signs of a mission gone sideways. What he saw first was indeed the fresh injury, a stark red line cutting across her lower abdomen, held together by a meticulous row of medical staples, glinting under the harsh bay lights. It was a nasty cut, no doubt, but familiar. It was the kind of wound one sustained in the chaotic crucible of close-quarters engagement. Yet it wasn't this recent injury, this visible proof of yesterday's defiance, that caused Captain Thorne's breath to catch. It was everything else his eyes took in. Below the fresh incision, her skin was a canvas of older marks, a sprawling, intricate map of scars that traversed her ribcage like twisted constellations. They were not haphazard. Some were disturbingly precise, thin, almost surgical lines that spoke of scalpels and meticulous incisions. But others were jagged and cruel, a stark contrast, whispering of blunt force, of tearing and rending. They were etched deep, telling a story that went far beyond the sanitized, almost dismissive account in her personnel file. Minor injuries sustained during 72 hours of captivity. Minor injuries. The words echoed in Thorne's mind, hollow and grotesque. They seemed not just an understatement, but a deliberate act of obfuscation, a grotesque lie. The scars spoke with an undeniable eloquence, a silent language of systematic torture, of prolonged suffering that no human being should endure, let alone survive with their sanity intact. Some appeared to be from invasive procedures, not healing ones but exploratory, meant to inflict maximum pain and psychological terror without directly endangering vital organs. Others suggested burns, carefully placed, meticulously inflicted to agonize without leading to immediate death. The pattern was too deliberate, too organized in its cruelty, to be the random consequence of combat or the result of a simple accident. It was the work of a professional, a methodical torturer. Captain Thorne felt a chilling realization creep over him, mentally revising everything he thought he knew about the woman standing before him. 3 years ago, Clark had been captured during a covert operation, a mission that had gone sideways when critical intelligence proved faulty. Her team had been extracted, but she, covering their retreat with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal, had been left behind. For 72 hours she was officially listed as Mia, a ghost in the system, until a Spec Ops team, during an entirely unrelated mission, stumbled upon her during a chance encounter. The subsequent medical report, dry and clinical, noted only minor injuries, physical exhaustion and dehydration. It stated she had been cleared for duty after a mandatory 6 weeks of leave and a series of psychological evaluations. Those psychological reports were thorough, meticulously detailed, yet utterly unremarkable in their conclusions. Subject demonstrates exceptional resilience and cognitive compartmentalization. No evidence of PTSD or trauma-related impairment. Recommended for return to full active duty. And return she did. She had thrown herself into her work with an intensity that had propelled her up the ranks with unusual speed, her commendations piling up, each one a testament to her seemingly limitless drive. But now, looking at the silent testimony of her body, something simply did not add up. The scars before him told a story of months, not days, of systematic abuse. It was a timeline that fundamentally contradicted the official narrative. Either the intelligence regarding her captivity was catastrophically wrong, or someone, somewhere, had deliberately obscured the truth. Given the political sensitivity of operations in that volatile region, either possibility was equally disturbing, equally plausible. The air in the medical bay, usually so sterile and neutral, suddenly felt heavy with unspoken truths, with the weight of a past deliberately buried. Captain Thorne found himself struggling to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was softer than he had intended, tinged with a new, unwelcome uncertainty. "How long were you really held, Commander?" The question hung in the air, a fragile probe into a deeply guarded secret. Clark's eyes met his, unflinching, unwavering. 72 hours, sir, as stated in the report." Her voice was devoid of emotion, a flat recitation of the official record. Thorne gestured vaguely to the intricate map on her skin. "These scars," he began, but she cut him off. It was an audacious move. One few officers would dare to an admiral, let alone a captain of Thorne's formidable reputation. "Are from before, sir," she stated, her voice maintaining the same efficient, uninflected tone she used during mission briefings. "A childhood medical condition, congenital rib deformities requiring multiple surgeries between the ages of 8 and 16. She delivered this explanation with the practiced ease of someone who had recited it countless times, a perfectly constructed shield, but something in her eyes, a subtle tightening around the corners, a fleeting, almost imperceptible tremor in her usually stoic composure, suggested there was far more beneath the surface. Captain Thorne wasn't buying it. He had seen combat injuries, surgical scars, and the indelible marks of torture before. What mapped Clark's body was not the meticulous work of pediatric surgeons correcting deformities. It was the brutal artistry of pain. "You're asking me to believe that these are from childhood surgeries?" Thorne pressed, his voice laced with disbelief. "I'm not asking you to believe anything, sir," Clark replied, her voice remaining steady, but a faint flush had begun to creep up her neck. It wasn't embarrassment, Thorne realized with a jolt, but anger, carefully contained, simmering just beneath her rigid control. Captain Thorne closed the gap between them, lowering his voice, an almost conspiratorial tone entering his words. "Commander, whatever happened to you doesn't appear in any official record I've seen. I need to know what I'm dealing with. If there's a security breach, a cover-up." "There's no breach or cover-up, sir," she interrupted, finally lowering her tunic, the movement precise, almost final. "There's only what's necessary." "Necessary for what?" Thorne demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface once more. Clark straightened, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her fresh wound, a fleeting grimace that she quickly suppressed.
"For me to continue serving effectively."
"For certain parties to save face, for operations in sensitive regions to continue without diplomatic incidents." Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "The arrangement benefits everyone." A chill ran through Captain Thorne. "Who authorized this arrangement?" he asked, his mind racing through the potential implications, the sheer audacity of such a cover-up. "Admiral Vance, sir," Clark replied, her eyes holding his steady. "Before his retirement. Vance, of course." Thorne knew the name well. The previous fleet commander had a formidable reputation for pragmatic solutions, for cutting through bureaucratic red tape, and for sometimes skirting the very edges of protocol. He had also been Clark's first commanding officer, the one who had personally recruited her from the academy, where she had graduated top of her class in linguistics and cryptography. The pieces, though terrifying, were beginning to fall into place. "And what exactly did this arrangement entail, Commander?" Thorne asked, his voice now almost a whisper, compelled by the sheer weight of the unfolding revelations. Clark's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, becoming even more rigidly controlled, as if bracing herself for the final unveiling. "I was recovered after 9 weeks, not 72 hours. The additional time doesn't officially exist. The nature of my injuries and the information extracted during interrogation were deemed sensitive enough to warrant redaction from all but the highest level records, and the psychological impact of whatever happened during those 9 weeks was addressed privately through channels authorized by Admiral Vance." She paused then, her voice a fraction louder, a subtle but unmistakable challenge entering her tone. She added, "I am fit for duty, sir." Captain Thorne studied her face, the composed features that betrayed nothing, the eyes that held his without wavering. He had spent his entire career reading people, assessing their capabilities and their breaking points. What he saw in Clark now wasn't the recklessness that others had reported, the instability he had come to investigate. It was something far more complex, far more profound. He saw a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering and emerged not broken but tempered. He saw not a liability but a force. The silence in the medical bay stretched, thick with understanding, heavy with the weight of untold history. Captain Thorne stood silent, processing the implications of Clark's confession. The sterile air of the medical bay, moments ago heavy with unasked questions, now thrummed with the weight of an incredible, terrifying truth. 9 weeks, not 72 hours. A meticulously constructed lie that had been sustained for 3 years. A secret held not just by Clark, but by a retired admiral, woven deep into the fabric of command. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Yet, looking at Clark, her face a mask of composed features that betrayed nothing, Her eyes holding his without wavering, Thorn saw no sign of a shattered psyche, no fragile victim. He saw something far more complex, a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering and emerged not broken but refined, sharpened. Yesterday's operation, Thorn began, shifting his focus, deliberately pivoting away from the raw, exposed nerve of her past, though its shadow now colored every perception. You disobeyed direct orders. The accusation hung in the air, a familiar point of contention, but now viewed through an entirely new lens. I adapted to changing circumstances, sir, Clark countered, her voice steady, devoid of defensiveness. The intelligence we received once on the ground indicated an immediate threat that wouldn't wait for authorization. If we had followed the original parameters, we would have lost the entire cell and potentially exposed our regional network. Thorn narrowed his eyes. You couldn't have known that for certain. Doubt was ingrained in his command philosophy. Every decision had to be backed by verifiable intelligence, clear parameters. With respect, sir, I could. There was a quiet certainty in her voice, a conviction that made him pause. The pattern of movement, the communications chatter, it matched what I've seen before. A brief shadow crossed her face then, a flicker of something ancient and terrible. What I've experienced before. And suddenly, the pieces clicked into place for Thorn. Clark's apparent recklessness wasn't impulsivity, wasn't a death wish as some had suggested in their hushed whispers through the command chain. It was the calculated risk-taking of someone who understood the enemy in ways that couldn't be taught in any briefing, couldn't be learned from any manual. Someone who had been on the receiving end of their methods, who had studied them with the desperate, meticulous attention of a prisoner, marking the routines of their captors. She had recognized a signature, a deadly rhythm, that only she, with her unique and horrific education, could discern. The realization shifted something fundamental in how Thorn viewed not just Clark, but the entire command structure that had so spectacularly failed to recognize what they had in her. They had been treating her like a liability, a potential instability, when she was in fact one of their most valuable assets. Not despite what had happened to her, but precisely because of it. Her trauma wasn't a weakness. It was a forged tool, a unique lens through which to perceive and counter the very threat they were fighting. Despite everything she had endured, the unspoken horrors now etched into her very being, Clark had never once requested special treatment or accommodation. This realization struck Captain Thorn with an unexpected force as he reflected on her service record in this profound new light. She hadn't sought comfort, she had sought purpose. "Put your tunic down, Commander," Thorn said quietly, finding his voice again, the previous accusatory edge now softened by awe. The medical bay's soft hum filled the silence between them as Clark adjusted her uniform with practiced efficiency, her face betraying no discomfort despite the fresh wound. It was a testament to her iron will, or perhaps a lifetime of suppressing pain. "Your record shows you've never taken extended leave apart from the mandatory 6 weeks after your recovery," Thorn observed, leaning against the examination table, his gaze now speculative rather than critical. "Not even when you were entitled to it." Clark's posture remained perfect, shoulders square despite the strain it must have caused her. "There was work to be done, sir. The answer was simple, direct, irrefutable in its logic." Thorn opened her file again, flipping through pages he had reviewed dozens of times, but was only now truly seeing. 3 consecutive deployments without rotation, volunteering for every high-risk operation in the sector, refusing promotion twice when it would have moved you to a desk position. He looked up at her, a challenge in his eyes, but also a growing curiosity. Most officers with half your commendations would be angling for a cushy administrative role or a teaching position at the academy. "I'm more useful in the field, Admiral," Clark replied, her voice still level, utterly devoid of ego or self-pity. Or perhaps you believe you're more expendable in the field, Thorne countered. Watching her reaction carefully, something flickered in her eyes then, not surprise at being read so easily, but perhaps resignation, a quiet weariness that hinted at a burden far heavier than any he'd ever carried. "Permission to speak freely, sir," Clark stated, her voice returning to its matter-of-fact tone. "Granted." "You didn't come here to discuss my career trajectory," Clark continued, her gaze unwavering. "You came to relieve me of duty because yesterday's operation deviated from parameters, and the brass needs someone to blame for the casualties." Thorne set the file down, a slight smile playing on his lips despite the gravity of the situation. Few officers would dare speak to him with such directness, such unvarnished truth. That was the plan. "Yes, then with respect, sir," Clark stated, her voice carrying a subtle, understated power, "let's not pretend this is about my leave schedule or promotion track." Thorne found himself chuckling softly. "Fair enough, Commander, but I find myself curious about something." He gestured vaguely to her midsection where the scars lay hidden once more beneath her uniform. "Most people who have endured what you have, what I now suspect you have, they either break or they demand consideration. Special assignments, lighter duties, therapeutic accommodations. I don't need special consideration to do my job, sir." The reply was instantaneous, almost a reflex. "No, evidently not. In fact, according to your performance reviews, you consistently exceed expectations in high-pressure situations. Your tactical decisions under fire are described as unnervingly precise. Your ability to anticipate enemy movements has been called almost preternatural." He paused, studying her, a new line of inquiry forming in his mind. "I wonder if your superiors would have used those terms had they known what I now know." Clark remained silent, waiting, a stoic sentinel against the ghosts of her past. "Captain Mercer notes here that you've never used the trauma support services available to all personnel, despite his direct recommendation following the Karak incident last year." Thorne continued, flipping a page in the file. "I have my own methods for processing stress, Admiral." "Such as?" "With respect, sir. That's personal." Thorne nodded slowly. "The thing is, Commander, when an officer consistently refuses support services, it raises questions about their psychological fitness. When that same officer also takes increasingly calculated risks in the field, it creates a pattern. My risks are never calculated to endanger my team." Clark interrupted, a rare crack in her composure, her voice a low, fierce growl that vibrated with suppressed emotion. "Every decision I've made has been to minimize casualties and accomplish mission objectives. At what cost to yourself, though?" Thorne pressed, seizing the opening in her armor. "3 injuries requiring medical intervention in the past year alone. The medical officer tells me you checked yourself out against advice each time. I heal quickly." The words were clipped, dismissive. "That's not the point, and you know it." Thorne moved closer, lowering his voice, though they were alone in the bay. "Commander, I've been in this service for 32 years. I've seen what happens to operators who use the field as a form of self-punishment or atonement. It never ends well for them or for the people who depend on them." Clark's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, a muscle twitching beneath her skin. "Is that what you think I'm doing? Punishing myself?" "I think you're someone who survived something terrible, and instead of processing it, you've channeled it into your work. That can be effective until it isn't." Thorne tapped her file. "Your psychological evaluations all say the same thing, exceptional compartmentalization skills. But compartments have a way of breaking down eventually, Commander." For the first time, Clark looked away, her gaze drifting to the window where the carrier's flight deck was visible, buzzing with activity as aircraft were prepared for the day's operations. A world of purpose and order, a stark contrast to the chaos within. "What do you want from me, Admiral?" The question was quiet, almost a plea stripped of its usual defiance. An admission that I'm compromised, that yesterday was a mistake? What I want, Thorne said carefully, is to understand why an officer with your abilities, who clearly has personal reasons to avoid unnecessary risks, would make the call you made yesterday. Clark's attention snapped back to him, her eyes sharp, piercing. Because it was necessary. The intelligence indicated— "I've read the intelligence," Thorne interrupted, his voice firm. "It was inconclusive at best, not to me." There was a quiet certainty in her voice then that gave Thorne pause. He saw no arrogance, only an unwavering conviction. "Explain." Clark seemed to consider her words carefully before continuing, choosing each one with precision. The communications pattern matched one I've seen before. 3 short bursts followed by a prolonged silence, then a single acknowledgement. It's a preparation sequence for an immediate purge operation. Thorne frowned. "That's not in any of our signal intelligence protocols. It's not in any manual." "No, sir. It wouldn't be—" Her voice remained steady, but her right hand moved unconsciously to her side, where the worst of the scarring lay hidden beneath her uniform. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and chilling. This was knowledge gained firsthand, in circumstances no operative should ever experience, knowledge seared into her very being through suffering. "So, you recognized a pattern that no one else could," Thorne said slowly, the pieces truly falling into place now, forming a horrifying but logical picture. "And made a call based on information you couldn't possibly share in the moment." "Yes, sir. Without requesting backup or special resources." "There wasn't time, Admiral, and I had confidence in my team's capabilities." Thorne sighed, running a hand over his face. The weight of his position, the expectations of command, pressed down on him. "Do you have any idea the position this puts me in, Commander? I have 3 wounded personnel, including yourself. I have a mission that, while technically successful, violated direct orders from command. And I have an officer whose judgment I'm supposed to question, but who apparently acted on intelligence no one else could have possibly possessed." He paused, his gaze fixed on her. "Intelligence that saved lives. If your assessment of the situation was correct—" "It was correct, sir." There was no pride in her voice, only absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that only comes from having lived through the consequence of being wrong. The Admiral studied her for a long moment. The Clark before him was not the reckless, possibly traumatized officer he had expected to find. She was composed, rational, and utterly convinced of the necessity of her actions. More importantly, she had never used her past, whatever horrors it truly contained, as an excuse or leverage for special treatment. In fact, as he now realized, she had done quite the opposite. Clark had taken the unthinkable experiences she had endured and transmuted them into an exceptional skill set that made her uniquely valuable in the field. Where others might have retreated to safety, she had pushed forward, using her hard-won knowledge to protect her team and accomplish missions that might otherwise have failed. This wasn't recklessness, it was a profound, almost spiritual dedication forged in fire. "You know," Thorne said finally, his voice a low rumble, "most people in your position would have requested a transfer after what happened to you, or left the service entirely. No one would have blamed you. I'm not most people, Admiral." For the first time, a ghost of a smile, fleeting and almost imperceptible, touched her lips. "And leaving was never an option for me." "Why not?" Thorne pressed, intrigued by this new layer of resilience. Clark's expression grew serious again, the momentary softness vanishing. "Because what I know, what I've learned, is too valuable to waste, and because there are still people out there experiencing what I experienced. If my perspective can help bring them home, then everything that happened was worth it. Captain Thorne felt something profound shift in his understanding of the woman before him. What he had mistaken for recklessness was actually a profound sense of purpose, one forged in circumstances he could barely imagine. Clark hadn't sought special treatment or accommodation, not because she was in denial about her trauma, but because she had already found her own way to make meaning from it, to transform pain into power. And then, the Admiral realized with sudden, stunning clarity, he understood why Clark had volunteered for the seemingly impossible rescue mission behind enemy lines. She wasn't being reckless as her critics claimed. She understood the terrain of suffering in ways no one else in his command ever could. Captain Thorne moved to the window, gazing out at the carrier's bustling flight deck. The morning sun glinted off aircraft wings, reflecting off the polished surfaces as maintenance crews scurried about their duties, tiny figures of purpose against the vast expanse of the ocean. Lives continuing as normal, a world of ordered chaos. While he stood in this quiet medical bay, his understanding of that very world, and the people who fought for it, shifting profoundly beneath his feet. The weight of his initial judgment, the collective opinion of command, felt suddenly hollow based on an incomplete and profoundly misleading truth. He had come here with a rigid set of assumptions, a clear course of action, and now everything was irrevocably altered. "There's something I still don't understand, Commander," Thorne said, his voice softer, less commanding, more reflective, without turning from the window. The question wasn't an interrogation, it was a genuine search for comprehension. "The mission you volunteered for next week." He heard Clark shift position on the examination table behind him, the slight rustle of her uniform, the faint sound of fabric against her healing wound. "Operation Kingfisher," she stated, her voice returning to its efficient professional cadence, as if discussing a routine training exercise. "What about it, sir?" Now Thorne did turn, studying her face carefully. He looked for any hesitation, any sign of the fear that should naturally accompany such a proposition. But her features remained composed, her eyes steady, betraying nothing. "It's a suicide mission, everyone knows it. Extraction of 3 intelligence assets from Vasha province, deep in territory controlled by the very same group that held you." He let the words sink in, allowing the grim reality of the assignment to hang heavy in the air. Most operatives would avoid that region altogether, yet you specifically requested to lead the team. Clark met his gaze steadily, her composure unwavering. "I'm the most qualified." The answer was direct, factual, devoid of any bravado. "That's what your request said," Thorne acknowledged, a hint of weariness in his voice. "I want to know why." He needed to understand the true impetus behind this decision, to discern whether it was a death wish, a desperate need for vengeance, or something else entirely. A moment of silence stretched between them, thick with anticipation. Clark seemed to choose her words with meticulous care, as if weighing each one for its exact impact. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, a hushed intensity, but no less resolute. "Because no one else understands what those assets are experiencing right now. No one else knows what they need to survive, not just physically, but mentally." "You think your experience gives you an edge?" Thorne pressed, though a part of him already knew the answer. "I know it does, sir." Clark stood up then, a faint wince crossing her features as the movement pulled at her fresh abdominal wound. She pushed through the pain effortlessly, her posture regaining its rigid perfection. "I know the facility they're being held in. I know the guards' rotation patterns, the blind spots in their security systems, and the psychological tactics they employ to break their prisoners." Thorne's brow furrowed in disbelief. "How could you possibly know all that?" "The intelligence briefing only confirmed the location last week. The facility in Vasha province was notorious, a black site that intelligence had only recently pinpointed with any certainty. Information about its internal workings was almost non-existent. because it's the same facility where I was held." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, striking Thorne with the force of a physical blow. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic thrum of the carrier's engines. "The official record says I was recovered during a separate operation," Thorne stated, his voice barely a whisper, grappling with this new, profound layer of deception. "But that wasn't entirely accurate. I escaped." "You escaped?" Captain Thorne couldn't keep the disbelief, the sheer astonishment from his voice. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile this impossible claim with everything he knew. No one escaped from Vasha detention centers. They were considered impenetrable, designed to crush the spirit as much as the body. It was an undisputed fact within intelligence circles that once you were inside, you were there until they were done with you. Clark nodded once. A stark, decisive movement. "On my 58th day of captivity, I made it 12 kilometers before a Spec Ops team found me," she continued, her voice devoid of triumph, merely stating a fact of survival. The rescue operation they were conducting failed. The assets were moved just hours before they arrived, but they found me, half dead, trying to reach the extraction point I'd memorized during my initial briefing. Thorne absorbed this information, mentally reorganizing everything he thought he knew about Clark's captivity, about the very nature of human endurance. An escape, an impossible escape, the meticulous planning, the sheer will to survive, to move 12 kilometers after nearly 2 months of torture. It was beyond anything he had ever encountered in his distinguished career. "And this information isn't in any report because," Thorne prompted, expecting another layer of political maneuvering. "Because the failure of that rescue operation was politically sensitive," Clark recited, as if ticking off a list. "Because my escape revealed security vulnerabilities that intelligence wanted to exploit later. Because admitting how long I was actually held would have raised uncomfortable questions about why a rescue wasn't attempted sooner." She shrugged slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of resignation. "Take your pick, sir." The decision was made above both our pay grades. Her tone indicated a profound, weary acceptance of the ruthless realities of their world. Thorne ran a hand over his face, feeling the fatigue of a lifetime of command pressing down on him, the sheer scale of the cover-up, the cold calculus behind it, was breathtaking. "So, you volunteered for Kingfisher because I've been mapping that facility in my head for 3 years, Clark said, simply cutting him off, her eyes holding an intensity that was almost frightening. Every corridor, every guard post, every blind spot in their surveillance. "I've been waiting for an opportunity to use what I know. You could have shared this intelligence without volunteering to go back in yourself," Thorne argued, though even as he said it, he knew the answer. No amount of briefing, no diagram, could convey the visceral lived knowledge that Clark possessed. "With respect, Admiral, some things can't be communicated in a briefing or drawn on a map." Clark's voice remained steady, but her eyes betrayed the deep current of intensity, the raw experience behind her words. The way the guards changed their patterns during shift changes, the sound a particular door makes when it's about to be opened, the specific cadence of footsteps that tells you whether they're coming for interrogation or feeding. She shook her head, a brief, almost imperceptible tremor passing through her. "These assets have been there for almost 3 months. They're reaching the breaking point. The point where people either shatter completely or do something desperate like attempt to escape on their own," Thorne murmured, understanding dawning, chilling him to the bone. This was exactly why Vasha was so effective. It broke men or pushed them into fatal errors. "Yes, sir," Clark affirmed, taking a step closer, her focus absolute. "And they won't make it without help from someone who knows exactly what they're going through, someone who can guide them through the mental maze as much as the physical one." I'm not volunteering because I have a death wish or some misguided desire for vengeance, she continued, her voice resonating with a deep, unwavering conviction that left no room for doubt. I'm volunteering because I am uniquely qualified to bring those people home alive. I am their best chance. I am their only chance.
Captain Thorne studied her, seeing her now with new eyes.
Not as the reckless officer he'd been prepared to ground, the liability that the command chain had whispered about. He saw her as someone with a profound understanding of the mission that went far beyond tactical knowledge, beyond intelligence reports. Clark wasn't being reckless, she was being precise, calculating risks based on information no one else possessed, information gained at an unspeakable cost. She was not driven by impulse, but by a chillingly rational assessment of capability, her own unique capability. Her past was not a burden, it was a blueprint. "What about your current injury?" Thorne asked, gesturing to her abdomen, trying to find a practical reason to hold her back. "Kingfisher deploys in 10 days. You'll barely be healed." "I've operated with worse, sir." It wasn't bravado. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same professional detachment she used to describe enemy patterns. She had clearly pushed her body to its limits before, healed and pushed again. The Admiral moved to the examination table and picked up Clark's file again, thumbing through it thoughtfully. The dog-eared pages, once symbols of her erratic behavior, now seemed to whisper of an extraordinary resilience, a relentless pursuit of purpose. "You know, when I came in here today, I had every intention of removing you from active duty." He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, a stark admission in his eyes. The general consensus among command was that you'd become erratic, taking unnecessary risks, possibly suffering from delayed PTSD. He closed the file with a soft thud, a decisive sound in the quiet room. "And now, sir, now I'm wondering if we've been wasting one of our most valuable resources by not understanding what drives you." His voice was low, filled with a newfound respect. "Your perspective isn't a liability, Commander. It's an asset we haven't properly utilized." Clark remained silent, waiting. Her composure was absolute, a testament to years of suppressing emotion, of presenting an impenetrable front. But Thorne sensed a shift in the air, a subtle relaxation in her rigid posture, as if a great weight had been lifted, or at least acknowledged. "I'm approving your request to lead Operation Kingfisher," Thorne said finally, his voice firm, echoing with the authority of a decision made after careful, deep consideration. "But with conditions." "Conditions, sir?" Clark's voice was neutral, but her eyes held a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even surprise. "First," Thorne continued, holding up a finger, emphasizing each point, "you will provide a complete and detailed briefing on the facility. Everything you know, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Every sound, every smell, every minute detail you recall. We will leverage every single piece of that hard-won knowledge. Understood, sir?" "Second, you will submit to a full medical evaluation 3 days before deployment. If you're not physically ready, you'll coordinate from the command center instead." He held up a hand as Clark began to protest, a faint frown creasing her brow. "This isn't negotiable, Commander. I'm not sending you in if you're likely to collapse halfway through the operation. Your knowledge is invaluable, but you need to be physically capable of applying it." Clark nodded stiffly, a grudging acceptance. "Understood, sir." "What else?" There was a hint of impatience in her tone now, a desire to move forward, to get to the mission. "Third and most importantly," Thorne continued, his voice softening slightly, a paternal concern entering his tone that he rarely displayed, After this mission is complete, successful or not, you will take 60 days of leave. Real leave. Not the kind where you hide in your quarters reading intelligence reports. Not the kind where you volunteer for covert ops on the side. Sir, I don't need, Clark began, a flicker of genuine discomfort crossing her face. The idea of inactivity, of being cut off from her purpose, seemed alien to her. This isn't about what you need, Commander. It's about what the service needs. You're too valuable to burn out, and that's exactly where you're headed. Captain Thorne stepped closer, lowering his voice, his gaze intensely earnest. I've seen it before. Operators who push themselves beyond human limits because they're driven by something deeper than duty. It works until suddenly it doesn't, and then we lose good people, people like you. For the first time throughout their intense conversation, a flicker of genuine uncertainty, of vulnerability, crossed Clark's face. What would I even do with 60 days? The question was so genuine, so revealing in its simplicity, that Thorne felt a surprising surge of protective concern for this formidable officer. Her life had become so singularly focused, so defined by survival and mission, that the concept of rest, of personal time, seemed utterly foreign. Whatever helps you remember that there's a world beyond the next mission, Commander, Thorne replied, his voice gentle. Whatever reminds you that survival isn't just about making it out alive, it's about living afterward. He could see the idea slowly, painfully sinking in, a concept as unfamiliar as a foreign language. Is that all, sir? Clark asked, her voice quiet, still uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Almost. Captain Thorne moved toward the door, but paused before opening it. He turned back, his expression serious, determined to convey the final critical point. There's one more thing I want to be absolutely clear about, Commander. Your value to the service isn't measured by how much pain you can endure, or how many times you put yourself in harm's way. It's measured by your judgment, your leadership, and your ability to accomplish missions no one else can. He met her eyes directly, his gaze unwavering. Don't make me regret this decision. I won't, sir. There was a quiet certainty in her voice, a profound promise that, despite everything, Thorne found himself believing implicitly. As he reached for the door, Clark spoke again, her voice a soft, unexpected whisper. Admiral, thank you. Thorne nodded, a silent acknowledgement. He understood. She wasn't thanking him merely for approving the mission or for the chance to use her unique skills. She was thanking him for seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the very first time, for recognizing the strength forged in her suffering, and not just the scars. Prove me right, Commander, Thorne said simply, his voice low, a final challenge and an unspoken bond, and left the medical bay. As the door closed behind him, Captain Thorne stood for a moment in the corridor, processing the unexpected turn the morning had taken. He had arrived intending to ground an officer he believed was becoming a liability, a threat to herself and her team. Instead, he was deploying her on one of the most critical missions in the region, now convinced she was not just their best option, but possibly their only real hope for success. The scars that mapped Lieutenant Commander Clark's body told a story far different from what her official record contained. But it wasn't the scars themselves that had changed his mind. It was the strength with which she carried them, the purpose she had forged from her suffering, and her unwavering commitment to use her hard-won knowledge to save others from the same fate. As he walked toward the bridge, Captain Thorne made a mental note to review other cases where officers' judgment had been questioned after trauma. Perhaps Clark wasn't the exception. Perhaps the system itself needed to recognize that some wounds, visible or not, didn't weaken a soldier but transformed them, giving them insights and capabilities that couldn't be taught in any training program. Sometimes, he reflected, The most valuable officers weren't those who had never been broken, but those who had shattered and rebuilt themselves into something stronger, more determined, and infinitely more knowing about the darkest corners of the world they were fighting to protect. The week leading up to Operation Kingfisher was a blur of frenetic activity for Captain Thorne. His decision to not only keep Commander Clark on active duty but to place her at the head of a mission deemed suicidal had sent ripples, if not outright shockwaves, through various layers of command. There were murmurs of Thorne's own judgment being compromised, whispers of him taking an unprecedented risk. But Thorne, now armed with the profound, unsettling truth of Clark's past, felt a steel conviction that superseded all doubt. He had seen an asset where others saw a liability, a tool forged in fire where others saw only a wound. His first priority was the comprehensive briefing Clark was now obligated to provide. Thorne had cleared out one of the most secure, soundproof debriefing rooms on the carrier. Only a select few were granted access. Thorne himself, the head of intelligence, the lead tactical officer for Kingfisher, and a specialized team of cartographers and signal analysts. Even in this high-level assembly, the atmosphere was thick with skepticism. They knew the official report on Clark's captivity, 72 hours, minor injuries. They knew the reputation of Vasha province and its detention centers, impenetrable, inescapable. No one had ever believed detailed intelligence on its interior layout could be obtained, let alone from a survivor. Clark walked in, her gait even, her expression composed, carrying only a small unmarked data slate. She took her place at the head of the long polished table, the room's harsh fluorescent lights illuminating the faint lines of fatigue beneath her eyes, the only outward sign of the ordeal she was still healing from. "Good morning," she stated, her voice clear and dispassionate. "Operation Kingfisher, facility debrief." She began methodically, not with maps or diagrams, but with sensory details. The air in the main intake corridor, she started, her gaze distant as if reliving it, smells faintly of ozone and stale disinfectant. Not a clean smell, but a biting one, designed to keep you on edge. The floor there is polished concrete, but surprisingly slick, especially when wet, which it often is near the drainage grates for the hosing down process. The intelligence officer exchanged a skeptical glance with Thorne, but Thorne merely nodded, urging Clark to continue. She described the acoustics. Footsteps echo differently depending on the material of the floor. Stone in the interrogation cells, worn linoleum in the administrative areas, raw earth in the subterranean holding pens. The guards, when they move quickly, create a specific slap-drag sound on the linoleum that tells you their emotional state, agitated, bored, or aggressive. She went on to describe the ambient sounds, the low hum of ancient ventilation systems, the distant clang of metal on metal from a fabrication workshop that seemed to operate around the clock, the faint high-pitched whine of the electric fences surrounding the perimeter. Then came the visual. The light in the holding cells is always dim, intentionally so, not dark enough to fully blind you, but just enough to strain your eyes, to make the shadows dance. The walls are a sickly grey, mottled with dampness near the floor. Interrogation rooms have single bare bulbs, often flickering, creating a disorienting strobe effect that plays havoc with your perception of time. She spoke of the guards' uniforms, their specific insignias that marked rank and unit, details never captured by aerial reconnaissance. The senior interrogators wear a bronze insignia on their left lapel shaped like a coiled serpent. They are the ones who employ the silent treatment tactic for days. The junior guards have a single straight bar. They are prone to frustration, making them exploitable. The cartographers, initially disbelieving, began to furiously sketch, their pencils scratching across their pads, trying to keep up with the torrent of precise, lived-in data. Clark wasn't just recalling facts. She was downloading an entire terrifying blueprint from her mind. She described the layout of the facility, not from blueprints or satellite images, but from the perspective of a prisoner. The infirmary is on the second floor, directly above the main guard common room. There's a ventilation shaft in the infirmary's storage closet that runs directly down into the common room. It's too small for a person, but sound carries, especially frustrated shouts after a long shift. She detailed the guard rotation patterns, not from theoretical observation, but from the meticulous, desperate counting of footsteps, the timing of meal deliveries, the changing of shifts inferred from the distinct sound of key fobs and the clatter of weapons. Shift change is at 0600, 1400 and 2200. There's a 15-minute window during the 2200 change when the main corridor is understaffed, as the outgoing shift is debriefing and the incoming shift is arming. It's the riskiest time for them, the safest for us. The signal analysts leaned forward, captivated as she described specific communications chatter patterns, not just the 3-burst sequence Thorne had heard about, but dozens of others. A single sharp whistle followed by 2 clicks. That's a prisoner transfer signal within the facility. If you hear it twice, it means an asset is being moved to a deeper, more secure section. Her understanding of their internal communication, a language forged in duress, was invaluable. She spoke of the blind spots in their camera systems, the precise angles where the dated surveillance equipment failed to cover, knowledge gained by painstakingly mapping the shadows and reflections during her brief controlled movements. "How could you know these blind spots?" the lead tactical officer finally interjected, his voice tinged with awe. "Our satellite imagery doesn't show anything that precise. Every time I was moved or allowed to use the latrine, I counted my steps," Clark explained, her voice flat, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I looked for reflections in the polished floors, for the angles of light from the overhead lamps. I pieced it together. When you have nothing else, your mind becomes your most powerful tool." The room was silent, a collective realization washing over the seasoned professionals. This wasn't just intelligence, it was an intimate, visceral understanding of the enemy, gleaned from the very heart of their operations. Clark had lived their tactics, absorbed their weaknesses, and turned their methods against them. She wasn't simply recounting facts, she was providing a living, breathing blueprint of hell. Thorne watched the team, their initial skepticism replaced by a profound, almost humbled respect. They were seeing what he had seen in the medical bay, not a broken soldier, but a tempered weapon, incredibly precise and lethally effective. 3 days before deployment, Clark submitted to her full medical evaluation. The lead medical officer, Dr. Aris, was a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience in military trauma. She examined Clark meticulously, her face grim. Clark's abdominal wound, though healing, was still a significant injury. Her rib scars were still angry, a landscape of agony. Dr. Aris ran a battery of tests, checking everything from her bone density to her neurological responses. "Commander Clark," Dr. Aris stated, her voice tight, after reviewing the scans, "your physical healing is progressing as expected, but you are still recovering from a recent surgical intervention. Furthermore, your body shows signs of significant chronic stress and past physical trauma that could compromise your endurance in a high-stress, prolonged combat situation." "I am fit for duty, Doctor," Clark countered, her voice unwavering. "My performance will not be compromised." Dr. Aris sighed, running a hand through her short, graying hair. "Your psychological reports, while noting exceptional compartmentalization, also indicate a tendency to push yourself past normal human limits. In a combat scenario like Kingfisher, that could be catastrophic." She looked directly at Clark. "You're cleared for light duty, Commander." but full combat readiness, it's pushing it. I advise against it." Thorne, who was present for this final assessment, stepped forward. "Doctor, Commander Clark has information critical to this mission that no one else possesses. Her physical presence on the ground is deemed essential for success and for minimizing casualties." "With all due respect, Captain," Dr. Harris said, her gaze firm, "my job is to ensure our personnel are physically sound. Sending her in like this is irresponsible. Her core strength is still compromised. A sudden impact, a fall, even prolonged exertion could reopen that wound, or worse." Thorne nodded, acknowledging her concerns. "I understand your assessment, Doctor, but the strategic imperative of this mission is extraordinary. Commander Clark's unique insight into the target facility and into the psychological state of the asset she's rescuing means her role transcends mere physical combat. She will be leading, guiding, observing. Her team will be there for the heavy lifting. Even so, Doctor," Harris persisted, "there are limits to what the body can endure, even for someone as resilient as Commander Clark." Thorne turned to Clark. "Commander, Dr. Harris's concerns are valid. This is not a request. If you are not physically ready, as per the conditions, you will coordinate from the command center. There is no room for bravado here." Clark met his gaze. "I understand, sir. I am ready. My mind is my primary weapon on this mission, and it is fully operational. My body will follow." There was no hint of arrogance, only a steely certainty. She knew her own limits, and she knew the mission's demands. After a long, tense moment, Thorne made his decision. He knew the risks. He knew the medical advice. But he also knew the unique value Clark brought to the table. And he trusted her. He trusted the impossible survivor who had mapped hell in her head. "Dr. Harris," Thorne stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Commander Clark is cleared for deployment on Operation Kingfisher. Ensure all necessary medical support and emergency protocols are in place. Double her medkit supplies for the mission. Make sure her team medics are fully briefed on her specific injury." Dr. Harris's lips thinned, a sign of her disapproval, but she nodded curtly. "Understood, Captain. I'll prepare the necessary orders. But don't say I didn't warn you." As Dr. Harris left, the silence in the room stretched once more between Thorne and Clark. "Are you truly ready, Commander?" Thorne asked, his voice low, a genuine question not just of physical state, but of mental preparedness for returning to the place of her darkest nightmares. Clark met his gaze, her eyes holding his without wavering. "I have been ready for 3 years, sir. I have been waiting for this." There was no pride in her voice, only an unwavering certainty, a profound sense of purpose. Her resolve was absolute. She wasn't merely going on a mission, she was returning to reclaim a piece of herself, to turn her suffering into salvation for others. Thorne knew with a certainty that transcended logic that he had made the right decision. The week leading up to Operation Kingfisher was a crucible of preparation, a testament to Captain Thorne's unyielding conviction. His decision to not only retain Commander Clark, but to place her at the spearhead of a mission widely regarded as suicidal had, predictably, caused a stir. Whispers of Thorne's own judgment being compromised circulated through the top brass, hushed concerns about an unprecedented risk being taken. Yet, armed with the profound, unsettling truth of Clark's past, Thorne felt an unshakable resolve. He saw not a liability, but an invaluable asset, not a wound, but a weapon forged in the searing fires of unimaginable suffering. His immediate priority was the comprehensive briefing Clark was now obligated to provide. Thorne had designated one of the carrier's most secure, soundproofed debriefing rooms for the purpose. Access was rigorously restricted to a hand-picked few. Thorne himself, the seasoned head of naval intelligence, the lead tactical officer for Kingfisher, and a specialized team of cartographers and signal analysts. Even within this elite assembly, an undercurrent of skepticism persisted. They knew the official report on Clark's captivity, a neat clinical 72 hours, minor injuries. They knew the grim reputation of Vasha province and its notorious detention centers, impregnable, inescapable. No one had ever truly believed that detailed intelligence on its interior could be obtained, let alone from a survivor. The very notion seemed to defy logic, bordering on the fantastical. Clark entered the room with an almost unnatural composure, her gait even, her expression a mask of professional detachment. She carried only a small, unmarked data slate, taking her place at the head of the long, polished table. The room's harsh fluorescent lights highlighted the faint lines of fatigue. Beneath her eyes, the only outward sign of the ordeal she was still healing from, the constant battle against the invisible currents of pain. "Good morning," she stated, her voice clear, dispassionate, completely devoid of any personal inflection. "Operation Kingfisher, facility debrief." She began methodically, her presentation a stark departure from standard intelligence briefings. There were no maps displayed initially, no satellite images projected onto the screen. Instead, she started with sensory details, painting a vivid, almost unsettling picture of the detention center from the perspective of someone who had lived its every agonizing moment. "The air in the main intake corridor," she began, her gaze distant, as if reliving each breath, smells faintly of ozone and stale disinfectant. Not a clean, sterile smell, but a biting, metallic one, designed to keep you perpetually on edge. The floor there is polished concrete, but surprisingly slick, especially near the drainage grates for the hosing down process. The intelligence officer, a man who prided himself on hard data, exchanged a skeptical glance with Thorne, but Thorne merely offered a subtle nod, an unspoken command for Clark to continue. He knew what was coming. He had glimpsed this unique tapestry of knowledge. She then described the acoustics of the facility, the way sound carried, shifted, and betrayed secrets. Footsteps echoed differently depending on the material of the floor. Stone in the deeper interrogation cells, worn linoleum in the administrative areas, raw earth in the subterranean holding pens. The guards, when they move quickly, create a specific slap-drag sound on the linoleum that tells you their emotional state: agitated, bored, or aggressive. She went on, detailing the constant ambient sounds, the low, vibrating hum of ancient ventilation systems, the distant rhythmic clang of metal on metal from a fabrication workshop that seemed to operate around the clock, the faint, high-pitched whine of the electric fences surrounding the perimeter, a constant, irritating hum designed to fray nerves. Then came the visual landscape of her personal hell. The light in the holding cells is always dim, intentionally so. Not dark enough to fully blind you, but just enough to strain your eyes, to make the shadows dance and play tricks on your mind. The walls are a sickly grey, mottled with dampness near the floor, almost alive with grime. Interrogation rooms have single bare bulbs, often flickering, creating a disorienting strobe effect that plays havoc with your perception of time, blurring the edges of reality. She spoke of the guards' uniforms, their specific insignias that marked rank and unit, minute details never before captured by the highest resolution aerial reconnaissance. The senior interrogators wear a bronze insignia on their left lapel shaped like a coiled serpent. They are the ones who employ the silent treatment tactic for days, designed to break the mind. The junior guards have a single straight bar. They are prone to frustration, making them exploitable if one knows how to push the right buttons. The cartographers, initially rigid with disbelief, slowly began to furiously sketch, their pencils scratching across their pads, desperate to keep pace with the torrent of precise, lived-in data. Clark wasn't simply recalling facts from a briefing. She was meticulously downloading an entire terrifying blueprint from the deepest recesses of her mind, a memory palace built of pain. She described the layout of the facility not from blueprints or theoretical diagrams, but from the brutal, visceral perspective of a prisoner forced to learn every inch for survival. The infirmary is on the second floor, directly above the main guard common room. There's a ventilation shaft in the infirmary's storage closet that runs directly down into the common room. It's too small for a person, but sound carries, especially frustrated shouts and arguments after a long shift. A potential listening post if one is desperate enough. She detailed the guard rotation patterns, not from theoretical observation, but from the painstaking, desperate counting of footsteps echoing down corridors, the precise timing of meager meal deliveries, the changing of shifts inferred from the distinct sound of key fobs and the clatter of weapons. Shift change is at 0600, 1400 and 2200. There's a 15-minute window during the 2200 change when the main corridor is understaffed, as the outgoing shift is debriefing and the incoming shift is arming. It's the riskiest time for them, the safest for us. A prime window for infiltration or egress. The signal analysts, initially aloof, now leaned forward, captivated, as she described specific communications chatter patterns, not just the three burst sequence Thorne had heard about, but dozens of others, each a distinct signature of the enemy's internal workings. A single sharp whistle followed by 2 clicks, that's a prisoner transfer signal within the facility. If you hear it twice, it means an asset is being moved to a deeper, more secure section, a blacker hole. Her understanding of their internal communication, a silent language forged in duress, was invaluable, providing layers of insight no external surveillance could ever achieve. She spoke of the blind spots in their camera systems, the precise angles where the dated surveillance equipment failed to cover, knowledge gained by painstakingly mapping the shadows and reflections during her brief controlled movements outside her cell. How could you know these blind spots? The lead tactical officer finally interjected, his voice tinged with a blend of awe and disbelief. Our satellite imagery doesn't show anything that precise. Every time I was moved or allowed to use the latrine, I counted my steps, Clark explained, her voice flat, as if it were the most natural, logical thing in the world. I looked for reflections in the polished floors, for the angles of light from the overhead lamps. I pieced it together. When you have nothing else, when every second is about survival, your mind becomes your most powerful, most ruthless tool. The room was silent, a collective realization washing over the seasoned professionals. This wasn't just intelligence, it was an intimate, visceral understanding of the enemy, gleaned from the very heart of their operations. Clark had not merely survived their tactics, she had lived them, absorbed their weaknesses, and in a twisted, horrifying way, turned their methods against them. She wasn't simply recounting facts, she was providing a living, breathing blueprint of hell, etched into her very soul. Thorne watched the team, their initial skepticism replaced by a profound, almost humbled respect. They were seeing what he had seen in the medical bay. Not a broken soldier, but a tempered weapon, incredibly precise and lethally effective. The air, once thick with doubt, now hummed with a newfound, almost reluctant belief. 3 days before deployment, Clark submitted to her full medical evaluation as per Thorne's conditions. The lead medical officer, Dr. Aris, was a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience in military trauma and a reputation for unyielding adherence to protocol. She examined Clark meticulously, her face grim, every movement betraying her deep concern. Clark's abdominal wound, though slowly healing, was still a significant injury, a visible vulnerability. Her rib scars remained an angry, mottled landscape of agony, a stark reminder of past horrors. Dr. Aris ran a battery of exhaustive tests, checking everything from her bone density and muscle integrity to her neurological responses and stress markers. "Commander Clark," Dr. Aris stated, her voice tight with professional disapproval after reviewing the latest scans and readouts. "Your physical healing is progressing as expected, but you are still recovering from a recent surgical intervention that significantly impacted your core musculature. Furthermore, your body shows pervasive signs of significant chronic stress and past physical trauma that could severely compromise your endurance in a high-stress, prolonged combat situation." "I am fit for duty, Doctor," Clark countered, her voice unwavering, a familiar refrain of defiance. "My performance will not be compromised." Dr. Aris sighed, running a hand through her short, graying hair, a gesture of exasperation. "Your psychological reports, while noting exceptional compartmentalization, also clearly indicate a tendency to push yourself past normal human limits, often to the point of self-detriment. In a combat scenario like Kingfisher, pushing those limits could be catastrophic for you and, by extension, your team." She looked directly at Clark, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "You're cleared for light duty, Commander, but full combat readiness for a mission of this intensity? It's pushing every ethical and medical boundary. I strongly advise against it." Thorne, who had insisted on being present for this final assessment, stepped forward, his expression grave. "Doctor, Commander Clark possesses information critical to this mission that no one else in our command, or perhaps even in our entire intelligence network, possesses. Her physical presence on the ground is deemed absolutely essential for the success of this operation and for minimizing potential casualties." He understood the doctor's ethical dilemma, but the stakes were too high. "With all due respect, Captain," Dr. Aris responded, her gaze firm, meeting his without flinching, "my job is to ensure our personnel are physically sound for deployment. Sending her in like this is irresponsible. Her core strength is still compromised. A sudden impact, a fall during an extraction, even prolonged physical exertion could reopen that wound, cause internal bleeding, or worse. She would become a liability, not an asset, if her body gives out." Thorne nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of her concerns. He was fully aware of the medical risks, but he also weighed them against the near certainty of failure without Clark's unique, terrifying insight. "I understand your assessment, Doctor, but the strategic imperative of this mission is extraordinary, overriding standard protocols. Commander Clark's unique insight into the target facility and, crucially, into the psychological state of the assets she's rescuing means her role transcends mere physical combat. She will be leading, guiding, observing. Her team will be there for the heavy lifting, to handle the physical engagement." "Even so," Dr. Aris persisted, her voice betraying a hint of frustration, "there are limits to what the human body can endure, even for someone as resilient as Commander Clark. She is pushing against a precipice." Thorne turned to Clark, his eyes locking with hers. "Commander, Dr. Aris's concerns are valid. This is not a request, and there is no room for bravado. As per the conditions we agreed upon, if you are not physically ready, if there is any doubt whatsoever, you will coordinate this mission from the command center. I need you effective, not heroic." Clark met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I understand, sir, and I assure you I am ready. My mind is my primary weapon on this mission, and it is fully operational. My body will follow. It always has." There was no hint of arrogance, only a steely, unyielding certainty. She knew her own limits, with an intimacy born of repeated violation, and she knew the mission's demands with a clarity forged in fire. After a long, tense moment of silent deliberation, Thorne made his final decision. He knew the risks, he knew the medical advice, but he also knew the unique, irreplaceable value Clark brought to the table. And he trusted her. He trusted the impossible survivor who had mapped hell in her head and carried its blueprints in her bones. "Dr. Aris," Thorne stated, his voice firm, resonating with finality, leaving no room for further argument. "Commander Clark is cleared for deployment on Operation Kingfisher. Ensure all necessary medical support and emergency protocols are in place. Double her medkit supplies for the mission. Make sure her team medics are fully briefed on her specific injury and potential complications." Dr. Aris's lips thinned, a clear sign of her deep disapproval, but she nodded curtly, acknowledging the order from her superior. "Understood, Captain. I'll prepare the necessary directives, but don't say I didn't warn you." Her tone was clipped, professional, yet a sense of foreboding lingered in her final words. As Dr. Aris left the medical bay, the silence in the room stretched once more between Thorne and Clark, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Are you truly ready, Commander?" Thorne asked, his voice low. A genuine question not just of physical state, but of the immense mental and emotional fortitude required to return to the very place of her darkest nightmares. Clark met his gaze, her eyes holding his without wavering, devoid of fear, filled only with a profound and terrifying resolve. "I have been ready for 3 years, sir. I have been waiting for this." There was no pride in her voice, only an unwavering certainty, a profound sense of purpose that transcended mere duty. She wasn't simply going on a mission. She was returning to reclaim a piece of herself, to turn her suffering into salvation for others. Thorne knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that he had made the right decision. This was not a gamble, it was a calculated deployment of their most unique and formidable asset. 10 days later, under the shroud of a moonless night, Operation Kingfisher commenced. The air on the flight deck was thick with the roar of engines and the scent of jet fuel, a familiar symphony of impending deployment. Commander Isabella Clark stood by the ramp of the stealth transport, her gear meticulously checked, her expression unreadable. Beside her, her hand-picked team, a tight-knit unit of highly skilled operatives, moved with the quiet efficiency of seasoned professionals. They trusted Clark implicitly, their loyalty forged in countless high-stakes scenarios. What they didn't know was the true blueprint of hell she carried in her mind. Only Captain Thorne, standing on the observation deck, looking down at the shadowed figures, truly understood the unique burden she bore. The transport, a sleek dark silhouette against the faintest hint of starlight, lifted off with a silent grace, vanishing into the night sky. The journey was long, deep into the heart of Vasha province, a region hostile and unforgiving. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Clark reviewed the mission parameters with her team, her voice calm and authoritative. Every detail, from insertion points to exfiltration routes, was meticulously covered. But beyond the standard briefing, she added layers of information that left her team exchanging curious glances. Details about the specific sounds of the wind through certain mountain passes, the texture of the soil in the landing zone, subtle cues no satellite image or intelligence report could convey. These were the instincts of a survivor, sharpened to a preternatural degree. Their insertion was flawless. The team rappelled silently onto a desolate, rocky plateau, the air immediately heavy with the same faint, biting ozone smell Clark had described. It was a smell that clawed at the back of her throat, a phantom limb of memory. She paused for a moment, letting the sensory input wash over her, calibrating herself to the environment. The wind whispered through the jagged rock formations with a familiar moan. It was here. This was where her nightmare began, and where she would end it for others. 5 clicks north. Clark whispered into her comm, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Then we follow the dry riverbed. Avoid the ridgeline at Grid Alpha 7. There's a patrol route with an acoustic sensor, old model, but still active. It'll pick up anything heavier than a fox." Her team leader, a burly, unflappable sergeant named Miller, nodded, trusting her instinct without question. His eyes scanned the rugged terrain, but he was relying on Clark's internalized map. As they moved through the desolate landscape, Clark guided them with an unnerving precision. She seemed to know where every loose rock was, where every shadow pooled deepest. She pointed out faint, almost invisible tracks, not military patrols, but local smugglers, a detail that would be crucial for blending in later if needed. Her movements were fluid, economical, every step placed with a deliberate intent, a ghost moving through a landscape it knew intimately. They approached the facility under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness. From their vantage point on a desolate hill, the detention center was a sprawling, low-slung complex, its perimeter, fences barely visible in the gloom, punctuated by the faint, high-pitched whine of electric current Clark had described. It looked exactly as she had mapped it in her mind. "Main entrance is to the west, heavily guarded," Clark briefed in a low voice, pointing with a gloved finger. "Service tunnel to the east, less visible but heavily trapped. We enter through the old sewage conduit, Sector Gamma 9. It's partially collapsed, but still navigable for one person at a time, and it bypasses all perimeter sensors. The entry point is hidden by a rock outcropping that looks like an old burial mound." Her team looked at the seemingly impenetrable facility, then back at her. This was not in any recon report they had seen. "You're sure about this conduit, Commander?" Miller asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "It's not on our schematics." "I am certain," Clark affirmed, her voice steel. "It's small, unpleasant, and hasn't been used in years, which means it's overlooked. Its structural integrity is compromised in 2 sections, but passable with care." Her knowledge was absolute, chillingly precise. They found the conduit exactly as Clark described, hidden beneath the unassuming rock outcropping. The stench was immediate and overwhelming, a foul cocktail of decay and stagnant water. Miller hesitated, but Clark didn't. She slipped into the dark, narrow opening without a moment's pause, her small frame disappearing into the reeking darkness. Her team followed, grimacing but trusting. Inside, the conduit was a claustrophobic tunnel of concrete and earth, illuminated only by their tactical headlamps. Clark moved with an almost preternatural ease, navigating collapsed sections and submerged pathways as if walking through her own home. "Left here," she'd whisper. "Mind the rebar." "Right, under that cracked pipe, the one that drips rhythmically." Her sense of direction was infallible, guided by a terrifying internal GPS of suffering. They emerged into the bowels of the facility, exactly where Clark had predicted, a neglected maintenance tunnel deep beneath the administrative block. The air, though stale, was a relief after the conduit's stench. They were in, unseen, unheard. "Main guard common room is directly above us," Clark whispered, gesturing upwards. "Ventilation shaft access is in that storage closet, through the narrow vent. We'll use it to monitor their shift change." Her description of the common room's acoustics, the faint echoes of frustrated shouts, confirmed her earlier briefing. They waited patiently for the 2200 shift change, the critical 15-minute window Clark had detailed. The sounds from above shifted, the heavy thud of boots, the clatter of weapons, the low murmur of tired voices. Then the distinct slap-drag of linoleum as the outgoing shift debriefed. Clark's eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to sharpen, processing every nuance. "Now," she breathed, a single decisive word. They moved with practiced speed and silence through the facility's internal passages. Clark led, her movements fluid and economical, her every step placed with a deliberate purpose that seemed guided by an invisible force. She avoided the camera blind spots with uncanny precision, navigating dimly lit corridors as if walking in broad daylight. She moved through the facility not like an intruder, but like a ghost returning home, intimately familiar with every shadow and every echo. They reached the holding block. The air here was heavy with despair. The sickly grey walls Clark had described were mottled with dampness, and the dim, flickering lights cast long, unsettling shadows. 3 months. That was how long the assets had been here. They would be at their breaking point. Clark had emphasized this during her briefing. They needed not just physical extraction, but psychological guidance through the terror. Clark stopped outside a specific cell. "This is it," she whispered. "Cell block D, cell 7. Her voice was devoid of emotion, but her hand instinctively went to her ribcage, a brief, unconscious gesture. The memories were here, palpable, raw. Miller prepared to breach, but Clark held up a hand. "Wait! Listen!" She closed her eyes for a moment, her head tilted, listening intently to the faint, almost imperceptible sounds from inside the cell. A slight rhythmic scratching, barely audible. "They're marking days," she murmured, a flicker of understanding, of shared suffering in her eyes. A survival mechanism. She spoke into her comm, a low, controlled voice. 2 guards, standard patrol, coming from the north corridor. Single straight bar insignia, frustrated, just finished their rounds. Her team immediately melted into the shadows, weapons raised, ready. The 2 guards rounded the corner, their footsteps echoing with the slap-drag on the linoleum Clark had described. They were indeed frustrated, grumbling to each other about a delayed meal break. They passed their position, unaware, their chatter fading. "This is the moment," Clark said. "Their guard is down mentally." Miller gave the signal and his team moved. The breach was swift and silent, executed with brutal efficiency. The cell door swung open. Inside, 3 gaunt figures huddled in the oppressive dimness. Their eyes, wide with fear and disbelief, slowly registered the presence of the Special Ops team. They were broken, starved, but alive. Clark stepped forward, her face illuminated by the faint light from the cell. She didn't offer a hand, didn't make a loud declaration. Instead, she knelt down, lowering herself to their eye level, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the haze of their despair. "We're here to take you home." Her gaze was direct, empathetic, and something in it spoke to the deepest parts of their tortured souls. A shared understanding, a silent promise. "We know what you've been through. We know what it's like. You're safe now. Trust me. I know this place." Her final words, "I know this place," held an undeniable authority, a terrifying resonance that seemed to calm their trembling forms instantly. It was the authority of a survivor speaking to other survivors. The assets looked at her, then at each other, and a flicker of desperate hope ignited in their eyes. The impossible had just become real. And so, Captain Thorne learned that some wounds don't break a soldier, they forge a weapon. Isabella Clarke's story is a powerful reminder that true strength often emerges from the deepest shadows, transforming pain into purpose. Her resilience, a beacon for us all, shows us the extraordinary capabilities hidden within the human spirit. If her journey resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to Veteran Biker for more untold tales of courage and transformation. What did you find most compelling about Clarke's incredible journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other videos appearing on screen now.